Welcome to a revamped Nightly Nonsense. We've been in the book of Nehemiah, looking at the story of Nehemiah. Got a whole bunch of truths out that, but I've been challenged recently, like maybe today, about Nightly Nonsense and what the purpose of it was. And the purpose, we said from the very beginning, was to make some sense out of the nonsense all around us. There is no nonsense in Nehemiah. There might be that which sounds like nonsense, things that we can't necessarily wrap our minds around, but God always makes sense in the end. So I want to give you a little something to chew on, right? Something that I was talking with a couple friends about today, and it goes something a little bit like this. We just always assume that when good things happen, that they're from God. We just assume that, right? Especially if we've been praying about it. So we assume that prayers that we say out loud are just always answered by God, right? That's a really good assumption, especially if it's in church. Places like that. Like, hey, we're in church, we're asking God to do something, and we want somebody to be healed. But a lot of times after somebody's healed, they don't walk with the Lord. They don't use the gift right. They don't do a whole bunch of stuff with it that glorifies God, and we're left going like, wow, what was that all about? Why are some people healed and not walking right with the Lord? And other people who we know would walk right with the Lord, they're not healed. Like, well, how does this all work? Right? And so I was thinking about this concept. The enemy always is trying to duplicate, replicate, and mimic God. He wants to be God. That's why he fell, right? He wants to be God. He teased Adam and Eve, specifically Eve, with that whole concept. You'll be like God. God doesn't want you to eat this fruit because you'll be like him, and he doesn't want you to be like him, right? So this concept of, listen, is every healing in a church, is every healing in a hospital, is every healing in a home that is prayed for, thought of, or just happens, is it always from God? Why do we assume that? Right? I asked this question. If the enemy had an idea that God was up to something, that God was about to do something big in an area, that God was about to use some people in an area, whatever it is, wouldn't the enemy want to mimic that ahead of time? Wouldn't he want you to think that God's working over here when God's saying, no, I'm going to be working over here? This happened repeatedly in the Old Testament, where the enemy worked equally as hard as God did at things. People weren't following these false prophets and these other gods just because they were, wanted to. A lot of times things were happening under the guise of these other gods. There's a reason why Pharaoh had magicians, right? So in the book of Exodus, right, there's the story of Moses, and Moses is getting ready to bring the plagues upon Egypt that God is going to use to release the people of Israel. And at one point, Pharaoh looks at Moses and says, you need to do something miraculous so that I know that there's a God, that I know that God is about this, right? And so that's how, believe it or not, the first plague starts. The first plague starts like this, right? It says in verse 8 of chapter 7, then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff, cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh, did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. That's a really cool miracle, right? One that I'm running the other way from. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men, the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, did the same by their secret arts. They did the exact same thing. Do you know what happens with the second plague? They do the same thing. You know what happens with the third plague? They do the same thing. The enemy is matching plague for plague. He has power. He has the ability. Would it ever serve the enemy's interests to heal somebody? To heal somebody in church that he knows isn't going to give God the glory? Yeah, right? That's the whole idea. If the enemy can heal you and you're not going to give God the glory, who gets the glory? Oh, right. He does via you. And that's what the enemy always wants. Do you ever wonder why people don't get healed? Is it always a God just up in heaven being mean God today? Maybe God's up in heaven going, you're not going to give me the glory. I'm not going to give the enemy the glory. What if part of the reason that healing isn't taking place is God just refuses to give the enemy the glory that he wants? But the enemy can mimic. The enemy can duplicate, replicate, and all the other Kates. He can do that, right? So we need to be careful at who we're giving glory to. Are there things in your life that are happening that aren't from God? Right? I use this other example. Let me leave this for you to really chew on. Right? If you're in a financial issue and you got some problems, and you gather a group of people together and you out loud pray that God would provide you with the resources to get out of debt or pay the bills or whatever, hospital bills or whatever it is. And you guys pray that, and the next day a check for $20,000, $30,000, $10,000, $1,000, whatever comes in the mail. We're immediately going to jump up and down and say that was an answer to prayer, wasn't it? The question isn't whether it was an answer to prayer. The question was who answered the prayer. If I take the $10,000 and give myself the glory and the credit and just keep living the lifestyle that I want to do, right? Then is that from God or is that from the enemy? If I'm praying for $100 and I get $100 and I go out and I spend it on all the things I shouldn't spend it on, did God really give me that $100 to do that? No, he might have. We like to say, yep, God gave it to you. You just made poor choices. You're just struggling with sin and you made poor choices. But what if the enemy? Do we not think that the enemy can resource what he wants? He can. So, a good friend of mine said this. Listen, in all these situations, what we need to do is get on our hands and knees and we need to pray. We need to ask God and ask Jesus what's real, what's not real. So, I want you to get into the practice of ascribing glory to who is deserving the glory, right? Meaning this, make sure it's of God if you're giving him the glory. Make sure that as you're witnessing something, right, you're not just jumping on the bandwagon of, oh, this must be a God thing, only to then have to explain why it wasn't a God thing later on, or what happened with the God thing, or why didn't the person, right? There are things that the enemy wants to get glory for in your life and in my life. Let's not give him the glory, right? Let's not give him the glory, but let's not assume that we're giving God the glory for things that God's not doing. That's a lot for you to chew on this night on Nightly Nonsense. Might wreck your evening, might blow your mind. You might have to do some repenting, right? You might have to say like, yeah, I've been giving God the credit for this, but I don't know that it was God who did this, right? You can easily know whether God did something or not. Just ask him. Let me leave you with this thought and the same thing. So Pharaoh's magicians, they make snakes too. Here's the difference. The Bible tells us that God's snake eats Pharaoh's snakes. That's how you know that it's a God thing, right? God never gets trumped. He never, ever, ever, ever gets beaten by the enemy. He's already won the war. Right? God's miracles, they trump the enemy's miracles all the time. We just got to look for it. We just got to figure it out. And we figure it out by asking. Hey, we'll see you next time. Nightly Nonsense. Revamped Nightly Nonsense. Maybe a new background for revamped Nightly Nonsense next time. Talk to you later.